Peace, peace, and welcome to our session focusing on reconnecting the educator's mind, heart, and soul through soul care and conscious work discipline. And so for our introductions, my name is Dekebra Crowe. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I am a DC mindfulness educator for grades pre-K through 5. I'm also a mom of twin girls who are 11 years old. I'm an education advocate and a certified yoga teacher. And I have actually experienced my own experience with educator burnout actually twice. And that led me to found my organization, DC Royal Gems, and we are a wellness education consulting firm. And I'm going to pass it to my partner.
Hi, I'm Dr. Melanie Desmuke-Battles, and I've been an educator for 13 years in the area of literacy. And now I'm an educational consultant, and I work with educators to strategically plan and implement social emotional learning, culturally responsive teaching, and restorative practices. I'm a wife, I'm a mom of two girls, ages 11 and 14, and I'm a soul care and justice advocate. I have too experienced burnout amidst other life challenges, which has led me to really implement soul plus self care into my daily routine. And it's also led me to help other educators in that area as well, as I founded Scholars for the Soul and Educational Solutions Firm.
And so our intentions for today are just really to be able to develop an understanding of soul care work and its connection to reducing educator burnout, whether we've experienced it or maybe not. Also enhance our pedagogical. Let me pause this recording. Our second intention is to enhance the pedagogical toolbox with strategies so that we can begin, supplement, and really sustain a healthy soul and self-care practice. We're going to also overview neuroscience and conscious discipline work to understand brain science and the impact that that has in our daily work. We'll also explore the neocortex region of the brain and the body's response for learning, trust generators, and building relationships. And then we'll just engage in some mindfulness practices to enhance your current mind, soul, and heart connection.
So before we get started, we are going to center ourselves and bring our mind and our bodies into this space so that we can be present and that we can learn best from one another. So we'll start with some deep breaths. You'll breathe in through the inhale through your nose, and then you'll exhale out, making sort of a whoosh type of sound. So as we do that, we'll lift our hands up to the sky. And I learned this from Dekebra. And then we'll come off to the side and we'll exhale. Then we'll inhale up again to center and come to the other side and exhale. All right. So let's try that. We'll do that about 3 rounds. And you just go with your own pace. So inhale, exhale to the side, inhale up, exhale other side. Do that 2 more rounds. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Last time, inhale, exhale. And we'll start with an affirmation. And so you can repeat this after me, or you can just say it inside of your mind. But the goal is to really set our minds on what our intention and focus is for today. So you can say the following affirmation: I am a soul scholar with the intention to reach the souls of every scholar with whom I engage. I am a soul scholar with the intention to reach the soul of every scholar with whom I engage. So the work we're doing is really integrating the soul. So I hope that you all are able to get something vital from this presentation.
And we're going to open up with an attitude of gratitude. So research shows that gratitude plays a key role in rewiring our brain based on whatever experiences we may have had. that practice consistently will help us rewire those things. So I invite you in this moment, if you have your phones out, you can open up your camera and scan the QR code. And it's just a way to engage in community, even though this session is recorded. So there's an attitude of gratitude wall, and just take a moment and you can add whatever it is, something or someone that you are grateful for in this moment. It can be a person, it can be something, and you can share that on our virtual gratitude wall. And then there's also the option is to write it down in your journal if that is more of a personal reflection practice for you in this moment. So some affirmations of gratitude, some attitudes of gratitude just to get you started. Just I'm grateful for having breath in my body. I'm grateful for sunshine and rain. The weather has been crazy in this summertime, right? I'm grateful for having an able mind and an able body. I'm really grateful to be able to do impactful work, and I'm grateful to be investing in myself. And that's something you guys can be grateful for as well as you're taking the time to attend this session.
So we're going to start with soul plus self-care. And as we talk about soul plus self-care, we want to look at this definition that identifies radical self-care from the abolitionist teaching network. And what radical self-care, which is actually the combination of soul plus self-care, is when an individual makes a decision proactively. So not in a response to burnout, not in a response to extreme exhaustion or fatigue, but you proactively make a decision to care for yourself by engaging in activities that feed your soul. And you do it in a way where you put yourself first so that you can combat stress related illnesses and the overall impact of stress on your life as a human and also on your profession as an educator. So let's debunk some of the myths. So oftentimes, traditionally, self-care has been seen as something for the elite, those who are more well-to-do, those who are centrally white, non-people of color have been able to engage in these things because as you see these pictures, one thing they have in common is money. And so we don't want to get into the idea that soul care and self-care is something that is commercialized. We don't want to believe that if I don't have the time on my schedule to get a massage or to get a mani-pedi or to enjoy a facial or buy the next beauty product, that I'm not able to engage in self-care and soul care. That is farthest from the truth. What soul care and self-care does is it allows us intimate time with ourselves, where we allow ourselves the space and the room to be poured into. So later we'll talk about different ways that you can engage in soul care and make it an ongoing practice for yourself. But we have to keep in mind that the work we do as melanin educators, as justice advocates, as people who care and love the children who are in front of us, and we want their well-being to be prioritized, it is exhausting because what is required of the work that we do is relationships. And relationships are a huge part of our work. And that takes an emotional investment that many of us are not truly aware of until we get into the work. So, what we want to do is, in order for us to make that emotional investment and still be whole and still be at our best in front of our students, is we have to deposit into our soul enough emotional funds so that we're not depleted dry. We want to eradicate the idea of hustle behavior and sleep, I'll sleep when I die type of mentality. We want to make sure that we're prioritizing ourselves at the forefront, which will in turn help us be better for our community and for our students. So I went back to our core. As Black people, we go back to African. Those from the African diaspora can think about how did our ancestors connect the healing. And so when we look back, there's an integration of the mind, body, and spirit. So this holistic view is actually becoming popular more now in the United States, but it's always been something that our ancestors have engaged in, from herbalism to divination to spirituality. Medicine was only a catalyst to the body's own ability to heal. So in order for us to engage in soul care and engage in practices that keep our best mental health as a top priority, we have to integrate work with the mind, the body, and the spirit. So a few methods of soul care I always want people to think about. At the top, you see meditation, you see deep breathing, body movement, and reflection. Now, these can look a myriad of ways. You can meditate with guided meditation. You can meditate in your own quiet and still time. You can be in a room. You can be outside at the park, sitting on your front porch. But meditating allows you to have that quiet, intimate time with yourself, with your spirit, with your higher power, so that you are able to be poured into. Deep breathing is something that helps us to steady our heartbeat. It helps us to clear our minds and reset and refocus. And so once we're in a relaxed state, the body is more able to release endorphins and dopamine and those kind of chemical releases that put us in a happy and relaxed state. Body movement simply is that. You can engage in yoga, it could be stretching, it could be any of those things that are similar to a mindful walk, exercising, but getting the body moving, getting the blood flowing helps our minds to be clear, helps us to focus, and helps to erase confusion and bring about clarity. And then when we reflect, we're able to get into those social emotional learning competencies. We're able to be more self aware of our emotions, of who we are, who we want to be, what our dreams are, what our goals are. And we're able to go about that through self management, by building relationships with other people, and by making healthy decisions. So if you look here, there are several ways that you can engage in soul care. So if you're looking, you practice grace, practice a recovery strategy. So as you get into this practice, you'll see that as you work for your students, sometimes there will be things that may trigger you to feel upset. You may be frustrated. You may be disappointed or sad. So come up with a recovery strategy. What will I do when those things come? Where will I go? What kind of things can I engage in that will bring me joy? So you can have several post-it notes and you write things that are inexpensive or no cost. And you put these things on slips of paper and you can fold them and put them into a jar. Have that jar at your desk. So when you see that your triggers are being ignited that are on the painful side or that are on the side of anger or disappointment, pull one of those slips out so that you can engage in something that brings you joy and that brings you clarity so that you're able to respond from a healthy space. So slow down and pay attention to the things that are going on around you. Be responsible for your own care, for your own healing. If you need to seek therapy, know that that is okay. Know that if that is what you need to get better, if that is what you need to think more clearly, then really engage in that and become more aware of that spiritual energy that is around you. Being aware of any toxic thoughts or toxic ideas that come up in your mind and making a deliberate practice to really release those because we always want to respond and engage from a healthy spiritual and soulful place.
So now we're going to shift and talk a little bit about neuroscience and really what conscious work discipline is and what that means and what that looks like. And so when we think about neuroscience, our brain is our control center. It's a highway of neurons, and those neurons forms connections and messages, and those are the things that send the messages through our body. So it's responsible for how we respond to things and how we react to things. And having a growth mindset is very important. We have the ability to change our mindset by the things that we say and the things that we think. And that is how we rewire and change our brain because our brain functions based on our experiences. Sometimes we have stored memories and stored experiences, and our brain doesn't always know the difference between reality and remembered experience. So we have to keep those things in mind and understand the basics of how that works, because we are all dealing with things. Our students are dealing with things. Our colleagues are dealing with things. And we have that ability to rewire our brain. So when we think of the brain is what's called neuroplastic. And that just means it's plastic, right? We can move it. It's able to change the structure. It's able to change the function. And again, that's all based on the things that we experience. And the way that we can work to rewire our brain as well, again, as Dr. Melanie was talking about, is just the importance of breath work. Because when we breathe, we are helping that connection with our brain, our heart, and our bodies, and that connection, so that we can optimally focus and operate in our prefrontal cortex. And that's where we are able to make those logical decisions, and we're able to make responsible decisions. And you may have heard of conscious discipline already. It is basically a trauma-informed social and emotional learning program that was put out by Dr. Becky Bailey. And it's really a way of organizing our schools and our classrooms around a concept of school family. We have to work together. Our brain has 3 states, and this is defined as conscious discipline, and that's our survival state. So that's where we focus on, do I feel safe? Then we have our emotional state, and that's, am I loved? How am I feeling? Thinking about my emotions. And then we have the executive state. And again, that's that prefrontal cortex that helps us make responsible decisions, helps us be logical. And so that is the first step in being able to control ourselves, being able to regulate ourselves, and then being able to teach children how to do that. We've heard this thing about trauma-informed social emotional learning, and that's really just being aware that trauma exists, being aware of what it is. So to define trauma, it's basically a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It can come from severe mental and emotional stress, and we know with COVID, pre, post, present pandemic that we're currently living in, that can be a part of trauma, where that's our collective trauma, and it's now time for our collective healing. And trauma can also be a result of physical injury. So when we're thinking about the impact that trauma can have on our brain, it impacts all 3 of those levels. When we have a high rate of trauma, or we've experienced multiple traumatic events in our lives, our brain is operating in that survival state. And that's good for us, because we need to survive. We want to be okay, and that's what our body does. But it's not okay to live there all the time. So when we are having these experiences of widespread trauma, our brain is not functioning at its optimal state. And so being aware of trauma is the first step. And now we have to think about the impact that we have on our children and where the children are. So the adolescent brain actually isn't fully matured until 25 years old. So that prefrontal cortex is still being developed. Children first develop their amygdala, and that's the part of our brain that, again, is asking that question, am I safe? And if I don't feel safe, these are the things that my body is going to do. It's always just a response. So being aware of that helps us know when we see behaviors manifesting, sometimes it's just the trauma that's manifesting. And we are quick to identify the behavior, but really thinking about, okay, this is a response, because behavior is just information. And once I have that information, what can I do with it? So our impact is really, really important as we begin and continue to maintain and teach social and emotional learning, because that's what's responsible for the development of our future. So we're going to have to think of things that maybe the way we discipline, the way we interact with children, the way we navigate our own traumas, and how we take care of ourselves. We may have to unlearn some of those things and relearn some other things. And it's okay, because we got to remember to also find joy in the journey. And as we know, trauma does impact our brain. We know that we can rewire our brain, but when we have experiences of trauma, it can impact the function of our brain and the structure of it. So awareness is the first step. That's also one of the core competencies of social and emotional learning, that self-awareness. So for reflection time, again, for you to become a little bit more self-aware, think of how you experience trauma, or any experiences of trauma you may have had. And these are just some journal prompts that you can use as you are reflecting and developing and enhancing that self-awareness. So thinking about, am I even aware of my personal experiences of trauma? Right? Do I know my own triggers? Do I know what makes me upset? Do I know what makes me frustrated? And then thinking about in what ways do I cope with those experiences? And what are some things that I can do that can improve my toolkit? Then we also have to be aware of the manifestations of trauma, right? So how does that look? How does that show up in my classroom? How does that look in my school? We have to also remember our interactions, not only with just the children that we are impacting, but the adults as well. And thinking about, am I prepared to respond and not react when that shows up? Remember, when we respond, we're operating from using all of our brain capacity. So we are able to make an informed decision and not just react based on impact or react on impulse based on the things that we are used to. And then also thinking about, hey, there's some area for growth, and that's always okay. We are always learning. There's always new information coming out. So really just thinking about what area do you need to learn more about? And we've heard a lot about trauma informed, being trauma informed. So I want to shift that to thinking about being trauma responsive. How can we respond when there's trauma, whether we are experiencing it, whether we're seeing someone else experiencing it, right? And that's the whole process of being a conscious, when we are talking about conscious discipline. So we really want to foster that safety and connection. So thinking about ways, what can you do in your classroom? How can you create that safe space in your room or in your school? Thinking about how you interact with people, thinking about ways, how can you create that consistent opportunities for connections, right? And then thinking about, do I know my community and those I serve? It's not always important to know the specific personal story and what everybody's trauma story may be. But if you do know it, of course, protect that and honor that gift that you may know that. But it's just important to be of the general types of trauma that's experienced in your community. And that's so important because we don't want to unintentionally re-traumatize anyone. We want to ensure we create a safe space where love is abundant and where collaboration can thrive. So what does this look like? Some ways this can look like is just having regular opportunities and a commitment to practice that connection and embodying that collaboration. So sometimes this looks like a morning meeting. We check in, we say, how are we doing? How are we feeling? A good resource, if you need more information about that, is the Whole Child Collaborative. They have a Strong Start program, and they have resources that really helps to build and foster those feelings of safety and connection. You can also make sure that you are taking care of yourself, doing the work that you need to do, and establishing and maintaining those community and personal boundaries. What are your classroom norms? What non-negotiables may you have? And make sure you have space to offer those things, setting community norms with students, if that is in your space, and accepting advocacy. So when a student is advocating for themselves and communicating a boundary, that is a safe space for them to do. And then a few other things we can do is just talking about how we can commit to maybe having an attitude of gratitude and practicing other mindfulness practices. And there's just some other ways that you can do that, as you can see on the screen, as well as affirmations, right? When we have those moments, when we may not be in the best headspace, and things that we can say to ourselves to bring us to our current reality and really to remind us of who we are.
All right, so as Dekebra talked about with the amygdala, we're going to look at versus opportunity, and really understanding that guard dog of the brain. So when we think about in our classrooms, what kind of environment are we creating, right? So as you spoke before, the amygdala is that section of the brain that says, am I safe or do I need to protect myself, right? So we have the thalamus that brings in those sensory experiences, and it's a communication dispatcher for the brain. So as it flows through the thalamus and goes to the hippocampus, that's where you get that work, that energy, that information begins to process. And so there is either a connection to a prior experience or to a background experience. So the brain is trying to figure out, can I connect what information has just come in to something I already know? And so that continues to allow the educator to determine, am I going to use the information that I'm giving to my students, give them an opportunity to engage in it with small chunks of information so that they can continuously move that information from short term into working memory and then hopefully into long term memory. But when we get to the amygdala, we have where fear can be housed, right? So if the brain detects that there is a threat, and threats can show up in a myriad of ways, students can feel like they are being embarrassed or publicly humiliated, whether by their peers or whether by the teacher. The student can feel like they're going to be a failure, that they're not going to do well. So there may be a lot of anxiety that rises up. So it's important for us as educators that before we go into the classroom, before we start a new unit, we take an assessment of our students' physical and mental responses to this new work. So that can be something as quick as an informal assessment where you give them a survey and you ask them to choose an emoji that represents how they feel learning about whatever the content is that you're going to present to them. If it's something new, try to connect it to something that they know just to get a baseline for how they are feeling in regard to this concept. It can also be in regard to your content area. So if you're about to teach math, if you know that your students have a particular math anxiety, if you know that because you've surveyed them at the beginning of the year and you've learned either they've always done really well in math, they've struggled, but they fared okay, or they completely feel like a failure when it comes to math. That's the kind of data that we need as educators so we know what type of emotional environment do I need to create because our brains, the limbic region of our brain tells us that we have emotional brains. So our experiences cannot be separated from the emotions that we have during that experience. So we need to know where our students are and how to make the environment safe. And so sometimes that may look like you developing trust with your students. So Dr. Zaretta Hammond has a powerful quote in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, which is the Bible for the work that I do. And it says, caring is the way that we generate trust that builds relationships. Trust between teachers and students is the effective glue that binds educational relationships together. So as you think about that quote, reflect even on your own time, or you can pause the video and maybe journal. But how do you show students that you care? If someone interviewed a student in your classroom and they asked them, how do you know that this teacher cares for you? What would your students say? So think about that as you go into the classroom. Be very deliberate and very intentional about showing your students that you care, because that is what's going to help you to build those relationships, which will allow you to create learning paths and alliances with your students so that when you encounter challenging situations, either related to their emotions or related to their academics and the content, you have a foundation that will help facilitate growth, learning, and opportunities versus a threat. So trust generators, remember, they start with us. And so these are a few tangible things you can do inside of your classrooms to start building the trust. So Dr. Zaretta Hammond mentions these in her book, and she talks about selective vulnerability. So that's choosing certain things to share that will help you connect with your students. And you have to be selective about that. There are certain parts of our lives that will help students see you more as human, see you as someone that has made errors, that has made mistakes, but that sees those as an opportunity to grow. So be selective, but share and be open with your students. Familiarity is meeting your students in places outside of the classroom that is familiar with them, getting on common ground with them, whether that's spending 5 or 10 minutes a week where you go into the cafeteria and you engage in banter and small talk and chit chat with your students. It could be going into the gym or visiting them in one of their games, doing things that are outside of the classroom to become familiar with them as a human, not just as a student. Similarity of interest. Once you get to know your students, and hopefully as you're getting the new year started, you're learning what are some of their hobbies, what are some things they like to do, and you can share stories, share that you have similar interests. Open yourself up to learn from them, and they'll want to learn from you. Genuine concern. So when you are sitting with your students and you are getting to know them, hopefully you're able to engage in non-academic check-ins. So you schedule in your weekly plans, you make it a point to have time set aside where students may be independently working, and you can call students up one at a time and have those 5 minute, 2 to 3 minute, if you want to start there, check-ins where you get to know them on a personal level. Not talking about their grades, not talking about their academics, not talking about their misbehavior, but just getting to know who they are and remembering. So you listen without interruptions, without distractions. You're not checking emails. You're not talking to someone else, but you're giving that student eye contact and you're actually listening without judgment and you're getting to know who they are. And you're showing concern and offering advice as needed. Sometimes students just want an ear to listen. So we listen more than we talk. And cultural competence, as you listen to the students, as you become more familiar with them, as you are in their community, you will begin to be more culturally competent. That means you will know and be better at understanding who they are as individuals, but also who they are as a part of a collective group. And then academic competence. Students want to know that you know what you're doing. So it's always good for us to sharpen our crafts, to try out new ideas before we bring them in front of our students, to have backup plans for when something doesn't work in the lesson to show that we are a teacher who is prepared. But if we're not prepared and things fall through, be open and vulnerable that you made an error, that you're still growing too. And this is a human process that continues on through adulthood until you leave this earth. So model and teach social emotional learning. Be transparent with your students. Avoid the idea of perfectionism. Don't teach your students that in order to be valuable, in order for their work to be accepted, that it has to be perfect. Allow wiggle room for your students to be creative, but to also learn from their growth. So as you reflect, think, which trust generator do I see as an opportunity for connection with my students? What have I already done? What can I do in the upcoming year to continue to grow in relationship with my students? So lastly, think about these building blocks. We want to block the release of cortisol, and that's that fear hormone that is released from that guard dog, the amygdala. And we want the students to not release fear because that fear can sit in our body for a long time and really cause students to either fight, flight, or freeze. And we don't want that to happen. So we want to release oxytocin, which comes from bonding with our students and building trust, showing them we care, and building relationships with them. So they can release dopamine and feel good about being in your classroom and feel good about learning. So create a family structure. The keeper talked about morning meetings, or if it's not in the morning, having those opening circles where your students are open to share with you and with one another. And you're creating a family structure. And remember, in family, everyone is not liked. Remember, in family, we don't agree all the time, but there is a solid love and bond that holds us together and pushes us to care for one another and even hold each other accountable. I said this before, listen without interruptions, without judgment, and give grace. So if you're doing these things for yourself, if you're listening to your own soul, you're giving yourself grace, you'll find it easier to extend that to your students. Use those trust generators that we talked about on the last slide. Use them daily. Affirm yourself and affirm your students on a daily basis because now we're rewiring the brain. We're training the brain with positive self talk. So we want to encourage our students and show them that making errors, making mistakes, making failing, or being wrong in something that you do doesn't make you a failure. It's a part of the learning process. So create alliances with your students. If you know that some students are struggling or they're having a hard time with either an emotional skill or an academic skill, create a pact with them where you all co-create a learning goal. And incrementally, you're checking back with how they feel and using that as data, as well as the things that they do in the classroom to use that as data to see how they are growing.
And so as we reflect on the things that we've shared today, there was a lot of information. We talked about a lot. I want you to think about moving forward. How can this look for you? What is this going to look like, feel like, sound like for you to actually do these things on a consistent basis? So I'm going to invite you to commit to something. So as we reflect, you can take a moment and journal here, or again, you can pause the recording, or you can come back to it and just really take a moment to really reflect. Where are you in this practice? Where are you on this journey? And thinking about these options, and then just giving yourself a rating from 1 to 5. And again, just like Dr. Melanie said, right? Giving that grace without judgment, just being aware, because that is so crucial. When we know when we are aware of our minds, we are aware of our bodies, what our soul needs, even what it lacks, we are able to make decisions, and we are able to create plans to fill in those gaps or fill in that cup, right? Because we want to get in that space. We are natural givers. We want to give. We give our students love, but we need to give and pour that love from the overflow, not from emptying out our cups. Our cups need to already be filled. So that's just one way that we can practice that, through this self-awareness and reflection. So thinking about these statements and just rating them as a 1 to 5, where you strongly disagree with as 1, or 5 where you strongly agree. So thinking about, I consider myself as a trauma-informed educator or leader, or I consider myself a trauma responsive educator or leader. I consistently prioritize my self-care. I understand the basics about the brain and the impacts of trauma. And as you kind of reflect on those things, you can journal these. And I want to leave you with some sentence frames so you can really name what your commitments will be moving forward, because we know this is twofold. We have to develop our own personal selves. We have to increase our capacity. And then we also have to use that and model that and embody that so that we can positively impact our community. So for this closing commitment, I want you to think about maybe something you might need to stop doing, and using the sentence frame, I choose to stop. Thinking about maybe some things you may have learned that are new, some things you may need to stop practicing, and just thinking about what you would choose to stop doing. Then thinking about something that you do and you may be comfortable with it, and maybe it might need a slight change, so, or just a deeper level of awareness when that activity or that task is taking place. So what do you need to use caution for? So I will use caution when or before this thing happens. It could be when I see a manifestation of a trauma in a student. I need to use caution with that. Maybe it's your voice and the way that you respond to things. Maybe it's about using caution when it comes to taking the way that you take care of yourself. And then green, right? Green for the go. What are some things you want to start doing? I will start whatever, right? Maybe you need to start practicing more gratitude. Maybe you need to get more movement in your body, because we know that all of those things are connected. We have to make sure that our minds, our bodies, and our souls are connected. That's the natural way. And sometimes with everything that happens in life, the experiences of life, the struggles, the stresses and challenges that we face, it impacts that connection. So we really want to be intentional with the way that we handle those things. And so thank you for tuning into this session. We also have a survey, because your feedback is invaluable for us. And we would love to be able to connect with you since this session is recorded. So again, you can pull out your phones, pull up that camera app and scan the QR code. And there's a short survey you can complete just to let us know about this session, as well as so that we can stay connected and reach out and get in contact with you.
Thank you for this opportunity. I enjoy sharing with you all, and I hope to connect with you all soon.